My name is Jessica Rowland, and I'm the Senior Specialist for Inclusive Peace at the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers based here in New York. And today we're doing our last Inclusivity Community of Practice of the year. So it's a thematic working group for the network, working on how we advance inclusion in different working areas. So today's meeting topic is going to be on strengthening the inclusion of traditional and Indigenous peoples in peace-building efforts. And you'll get to hear from some network members and supporters how they've been advancing this inclusion of traditional and Indigenous peoples in various ways through the past couple of years. So we'll start by hearing from a couple different UN departments and engagements in how they're working in advancing the leadership of traditional and Indigenous peace builders. And then we'll follow with a panel where we'll actually get to hear from various traditional and Indigenous peoples groups and representations from various regions. You'll get to hear directly from them on their thoughts of how we can advance inclusion. And then we'll want to hear from everybody on your work and how you're advancing this agenda in your local communities. So that will be today's meeting. I just want to give one announcement since it is the last meeting. I want to quickly give a shout out to the 2024 Inclusivity Steering Committee, who's led the different outputs of this year's 4 meetings. And now we will turn it to first our presenters. So I will first turn it to Simona Krushani, who is the Political Affairs Officer for the UN Office on the Prevention of Genocide, to share about the work of their office.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for having me speaking in this important meeting. The end of the year is the end of 2000, since the end of 2004, but the beginning also of the new year that is approaching, and I'm sure that it signals the continuation of a strong collaboration that us as an office has always been having with you for a long time and on different critical issues. So, Jessica, I also want to recognize you for your leadership on this specific program on inclusivity. I've been knowing you for a long time, and I think, it's the program, is the signature program at the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers. So kudos to you. Before I get into the core of my presentation, I just want us to be on the same side, on the same page, and to recall the mandate of my office, the Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. You probably have been hearing a lot about my office recently, that the genocide war, that the G war has been applied to many of the current situations we are all following very closely, rightly or not, but it's a mandate that has been on the spotlight for different reasons recently. But in reality, we do our mandate includes the provision of early warning to the Secretary General and through him to the Security Council, and then the enhancement of the capacity of the all United Nations systems to prevent genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And for entire United Nations system, we include not only the United Nations system, but also all its member states and civil society organizations. And finally, we advocate advocate for the prevention of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So this is the core of the mandate, but while we focus on early warning, on capacity building or advocacy, we also engage with many relevant stakeholders on the ground who help us implement our mandate. Because these are the eye and the ears of our mandate, are those who are closed and who are on the front line in the prevention, but also are in the front line of combating these crimes. So this is, for this reason, my office has been always engaging, for instance, with religious leaders. And some of you who might recall our engagement with the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers in the development of the plan of action for religious leaders and actors to prevent incitement to violence that goes back, it was launched in 2017. You might recall the priority that this project was for us and still is. We thought and we still think that religious leaders and actors have a strong influence on so large communities, and that's why it was necessary and it is necessary to have them involved in comprehensive strategies for the prevention of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Under the outgoing special advisor on the on genocide prevention, you might have heard that she left, that she ended her term on the 26th of November. Under her mandate, we developed another strong focus to engage with stakeholders on the ground, this being the traditional leaders. So Mr. Itu, the previous special advisor on the prevention of genocide, as a matter of fact, thought that the plan of action for religious leaders were not enough because traditional leaders, they are not always religious leaders, and traditional leaders have also a very important role in administering local communities in so many countries around the world. So it was necessary to also engage with this group of stakeholders to include them in strategies for the prevention of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. We know very well that traditional leaders hold credibility and legitimacy within their community. They have unique connections with their community based on mutual respect and trust. And that's why many times they are involved in preventative action. They are those who are really on the front line, acting as soon as they see the first early warning signs for violence that sometimes are also the early warning signs of the more serious crimes, including genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. We know also that it is not always easy to work with traditional leaders because the modern society, in some context, has sidelined them. So we recognize the very important task as an office that we had in including them again in prevention strategies by developing a document, a policy paper based on the work that we had done with religious leaders around the world, so that we could come up with a series of recommendations. And I think some of the audience, some of the participants in this workshop today, this webinar, they have also been involved in developing these recommendations. This is when we started to organize workshops, and this goes back to May of 2022. We worked very closely with the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers to organize the first consultation with traditional leaders that took place in Nigeria. And out of this consultation, we prepared an initial draft plan of action. With this plan of action, after 1 year, we went to the Sultanate of Oman in November 2023, this time with the strong support of the Sultanate, and we fine-tuned the plan of action. Finally, last year, actually not, in April of 2024, so some 6 months ago, we also, with the help of the network, organized a consultation in New York on the sidelines of the Forum of Indigenous People to also hear the feedback on the draft from indigenous leaders that we know sometimes are also traditional leaders in their own communities. So all the inputs were compiled into what we call plan of action, the plan of action for traditional leaders and actors in countering hate speech, preventing incitement to violence, and preventing genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The title is very long, but it speaks a lot about hate speech and incitement to violence being very important early warning signs for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. We all, in our office, we have a strong focus on this specific early warning sign because we think there is a direct connection between hateful narratives and the risk of the most serious international crimes, as we have seen, for instance, in Rwanda in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, but also in Bosnia and previously in Cambodia and during the Holocaust in the Nazi Germany. So, and this is why the plan of action has a strong focus also on the role of traditional leaders in handling hate speech and preventing incitement to violence. So the plan of action is finalized, but it has been under embargo because, as I mentioned, the previous special advisor left before launching it. So we are, with the network, we are trying to identify a new date for the launch of this important document that will probably happen during the term of the new special advisor once he or she has been nominated. But in the meantime, I wanted you to know that it comprises five more pillars, five main pillars. The first pillars focus on strengthening and supporting traditional dispute mechanisms to prevent genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and their incitement, including by mediating in situation of risk of these crimes. We know that traditional leaders, as I mentioned already at the beginning of my presentation, they have a very strong role in mediating disputed conflicts in their own communities. The second pillar focuses on developing strategic communication and messaging for alternative or counter narratives associated with acts of incitement to violence that could lead to genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And here we zoom in the plan of action on the specific role that traditional leaders and actors have in their community in identifying hateful narratives that could lead to genocide and related crimes. The third pillar focuses on engaging and strengthening intra and inter-community dialogue and activities to foster social cohesion. So here we see really the role of traditional leaders in bringing communities together. The communities, they're not always composed of one group only. They are diverse. They are inter-ethnic. Sometimes they are inter-religious. Sometimes they are inter-ethnic and inter-religious. So we see the very important role of traditional leaders in bringing this diverse group together and in supporting dialogue as a method of preventing violence and building peace. The fourth pillar focuses on building or revising education tools and curricula, including for grown-ups and providing capacity building and capacity sharing opportunities. So we think in our office that education is a very important tool of prevention, especially when we talk about early prevention. And it's only by using education, formal and informal, but also at different levels, and not only primary, secondary, and tertiary, but also seeing it as a continuous learning, right? That we can have comprehensive strategies of preventing genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Last but not least, the fifth pillar focuses on traditional authorities' engagement with stakeholders, including political leaders, on decentralization processes to increase the capacity of traditional leaders in negotiation and mediation of identity conflicts, contributing to prevention of genocide and related crimes. As I mentioned at the beginning in my presentation, unfortunately, we know that in some contexts, these leaders have been sidelined by the modern society. So it's important to bring them back at the core of the community and provide them with the role that they deserve in solving disputes and mediating conflict. So this plan of action, while we think it's finalized, we consider it as a work in progress. So we will continue to in the future, even after it has been launched, we will continue to research, engage with traditional leaders on the ground to get their feedback and to see how it can be improved. We know things change in the international affairs very quickly also. We're seeing this in the current scenarios. So it's important that we remain updated and this plan of action is also updated with the most useful approaches and tools that can be used by traditional leaders in their own communities to prevent genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So I have no doubt that we will continue working with the network for religious and traditional peacemakers. As I mentioned, they have been a great partners of ours during many, many, many years. I know personally most of the staff and I work with them personally on so many projects. So we really welcome these collaborations in the year to go, not only on the finalization and implementation of this plan of action, but also on so many other areas of joint concern. And I also use this opportunity to call for more in-depth collaboration with other entities in the United Nations system. I know that the genocide word scares many, but I think it's important that we join hands and work with the one UN when it comes to prevention, and including when we want to engage the traditional leaders who are such important partners in prevention and in peace building. I will stop here and over to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Simona. And I know I see, as you said, some of our participants in developing the plan of action here in the meeting. I see Musab, I see King Nana, I see Queen Gladys, and I see Tong Peng. So I know that they're also still with us here on this journey.
Yeah. And Jessica, if I
Yeah.
may, the women in this consultation played a super important role. Queen Nana, Queen Gladys, and others. So I want to recognize their role and their leadership in really pushing for an inclusive plan of action that considers and supports the role of female traditional leaders. It's not always easy, as in many other contexts, patriarchy is there, especially when we deal with leadership. And this is something that I know also very well from our work with religious leaders. But the role of female leaders is extremely important in pushing forward, actually in developing and also pushing for the implementation of this plan of action.
Yes, I completely agree. And I also see that our executive director, Dr. Mohammed El Sanusi, is online. Mohammed, I didn't want to put you on the spot, but just in case you wanted to say anything.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you so much for putting this together. This is I wasn't planning to speak, but I was really inspired by the attendance, by the amazing presentation from Simona. Thank you so much, Simona, for your leadership and the collaboration with your office for over a decade. We developed a number of plan of actions. This is being the last one. Well, not the last, the latest one, let me put it this way. And hopefully, I completely agree with you. We will work together in launching this plan of action in the future in coordination with your office, as well as with the one UN that you mentioned. I also wanted to emphasize the point, Simona, you made about the critical role of women in the developing of this particular plan of action, women and youth. And the only, what I can envision that as we move forward, the implementation also will be led by women, because that will guarantee actually the success of the plan of action. As we all know, when women are involved in peace mediation, in implementation of plan of action, then we see a very high rate of success. And that's not going to be different in this one as well. So with those words, I just want to thank everybody that's attending this particular, meeting here, the last one in the year. And I wish everybody a happy holidays. And hopefully we will convene again as we move forward in the plan of action. Thank you so much, Jessica. Back to you.
Thank you, Mohammed. And thank you again, Simona, for all of your great contributions and partnerships, and continuing and to keep everybody also informed in this meeting of our plans moving forward in the upcoming year. So now I will turn to our next guest speaker, Ms. Fiorella Triscritti. I was so concentrated on the last name. Was a political affairs officer for the UN Department of Political Affairs. So I will turn it now to hear about your office's work.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm joined by several colleagues by DPPA, including Bautista, who will speak after me, and Peter and David. But let me start also by saying, like Simona, we're one UN. That's what we're trying to do. And thank you again for having us here. So what we're going to do in our 10 minutes presentation is just a bit of a recap about DPPA, the department that we work for, and what we do in terms of Indigenous issues. So the DPPA is an acronym. It's an English acronym that stands for the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. It's a very long name. But basically, DPPA, what do we do, first of all, overall? So our mandate is really to prevent and resolve conflicts around the world. So among other things, what we work on is monitoring political developments as the first, assessing. Then secondly, we advise the UN Secretary General. The third one, we oversee political missions. For instance, in the Western Hemisphere, we have two, Haiti and Colombia. We, of course, support member states, and this expands to also the work of the Security Council and other bodies of the UN system. And then, of course, we also work on addressing violence against women. And this is our big agenda on women, peace, and security. So just to summarize these several points, is basically one is first to advise and monitor the Secretary General on peace and security issue overall and prevent conflict. And then the second one, I think, it has more a direct link with member states, with our interlocutors, and it's about promoting your efforts to peace building, basically. And within that, as Simona was saying, working with traditional leaders, working with indigenous people is key, because you are in the front line really of conflict. Now, in terms of indigenous issues, then this naturally basically follows. And so what do we do? The first that we are trying to do is to monitor, analyze conflicts that involve indigenous peoples. And then we also try to ensure and enhance their inclusion in all UN efforts to support political dialogue, mediation, and building sustainable peace. And what we're going to do, myself and Bautista, I'm going to give you some examples from the headquarters in terms of our work with indigenous issues, and then Bautista will then follow with some concrete examples in the field of our work. So from here, what do we mean by analyzing, monitoring? This is mean engaging, right? So first of all, an example, we regularly engage with the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. We engage with its members. We engage with the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And these are key exchanges because we really want to hear from them. We want to hear their perspective on conflict. What is going on? What are the triggers? What are the concerns? Because unless you really reach out to the other perspective, you may end up with just one vision of a conflict analysis. At the same time, it must be said that we need to manage expectations. Our work is more analytical. It doesn't mean that we can do necessarily. We're not going to be the one saying a lot. We're not going to be the one perhaps being very public and visible. But trust us, any information that we receive is crucial to then provide advice to senior principals within the UN system. And they are the ones who can then say, pass on messages to member states, raise the alert as needed in concrete situations. And then another work is as well to strengthen the work of to strengthen understanding within DPPA, within the UN system about indigenous governance, indigenous methods of conflict resolutions. And this is something that we'll be starting to do more recently. And it's a fascinating journey. And just to mention one example, recently we worked with Bina, who I know is here joining us today. We've been very excited about her initiative building up this network of Indigenous Peace Builder, and we're trying to see how can we collaborate, how can we help each other, how can we learn from Indigenous mediators, because as DPPA we come with our toolkit, we come with our ideas, but we can be more inclusive, and by being more inclusive, meaning we want to reshape as well how we do things, including the Indigenous perspective. It's not easy, it will take time, but we have this vision. And perhaps maybe just a final point in terms of our work with member states from headquarters. Of course, there is a lot of engagement in terms of meetings and hearing and responding to their requests. And perhaps just a concrete example there, right now, one of our colleagues is in Guyana. There was a request for electoral assistance. And so as per usual, DPPA deploys a team jointly with other UN agencies, in this case, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. They conduct an assessment of the electoral needs of a country. And when we set up our agenda of who we're going to talk to, talking to Indigenous peoples, Indigenous leaders is very important, because we want to hear what are their needs, what are their views on electoral issues, for instance, in this case. So I hope that this gave you a bit of a sort of like an idea of what we aim, what's our mandate, but also our hope to promote the rights of Indigenous peoples from a political perspective, from a conflict prevention perspective. There is a lot more, but I'm more than happy to answer a question if there's a chance later on during the session. And we're always available and to be in contact and to hear from you. This is really what we wish. And so now I'm going to turn it to Bautista, who's going to take us to the field to hear more about the work of DPPA with Indigenous Peace Builders. Thank you.
Thanks so much, colleagues. Can you hear me well? Because my camera was a little bit, I don't know. Is it okay? Good. I am Bautista Lojoko, and I work for the Peacebuilding Support Office within the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, where I oversee peacebuilding projects funded by the Secretary General Peacebuilding Fund, what we call the PBF, in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so I will focus a little bit, my sharing of experiences in that region, but we also have and support Indigenous peacebuilding efforts in different parts of the world. So at PBSO, we are conscious that there is a need to improve efforts to address challenges and barriers faced by Indigenous peoples in conflict prevention and resolution efforts, including in mediation and dialogue processes. And this is a priority for PBSO. What we see is that barriers to participation of Indigenous peoples in political processes has led to structural social division and an increased risk of protest in the absence of or limited or poorly functioning formal avenues to express discontent and influence policymaking. Some of the main challenges faced by Indigenous peoples that we see include, on access to justice, criminalization of those defending their rights, a lack of fulfillment of Indigenous peoples' right to free, prior, and informed consent, which represent frequent sources of conflict. And in the region I cover in Latin America, that is very clear. But there are also opportunities for enhanced UN engagement on prevention and peace building with different stakeholders. Also, the fulfillment of the rights of Indigenous peoples for us is very closely linked to the work we are doing on environmental sustainability and climate security to advance peace building. So on climate peace and security and environmental peace building. Lack of secure access to and ownership of natural resources and weak mechanisms for social cohesion, as was mentioned by my colleagues before, can deepen tensions over land and power between Indigenous communities, the state, the private sector, and other groups. We do see this taking place in those conflict analyses that we request before we fund the project, because we ask for conflict analysis that is inclusive, so as to serve as basis for a peace building intervention. Insecure land tenure by indigenous communities can be a cause of conflict, drive environmental degradation, and limit socioeconomic development. So in this context, I wanted to share a couple of examples in the Latin American region where the PBF has been supporting indigenous peoples' efforts and participation in peace-building processes. In Colombia, for example, a project called Intercultural Maequiwe, Mother Earth, that is implemented by an NGO called War Child, focuses on safe and meaningful participation in political and peace-building processes of Afro-descendant and indigenous young women and men, while promoting indigenous right to life, physical and mental integrity, and personal authority. An interesting thing is that this project supported the establishment of hubs in collaboration with organizations led by indigenous youth as spaces that provide a safe environment that facilitates the participation of young women and men, but with a focus on young women from different territories. This happens in territories with high activity from armed groups, where youth and indigenous youth participation and indigenous young women participation in civic spaces is limited by the activities of these armed groups and the risks to their protection and lives. So that's why this is one of the interventions that this project is supported. Young women who participate in these hubs have co-created methodologies for sharing knowledge about gender, patriarchy, racism, ethnicity, and indigenous epistemologies. But they also created mentorship programs for other women in their communities with a focus on women's roles in history, the concept of gender in the NASA indigenous peoples in Colombia, women and leadership in indigenous territories, and gender-based violence prevention. In Guatemala, which is another country where we're supporting quite a few efforts from indigenous peoples, a PBF project implemented by FAO, OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the World Food Program in the Polo Chic Valley, which is an area of the country historically affected by land and agrarian conflicts, trained almost 600 indigenous Quechua leaders in 10 communities to strengthen their participation in the management of agrarian conflicts and in other local decision-making mechanisms, including on food security, for instance, which is very much linked to agrarian type of conflicts. We have another project in Guatemala, which is called Consolidating Infrastructures for Sustaining Peace, which is implemented by UNDP, UNESCO, and UN Women. All these projects are designed based on consultations with indigenous peoples, and then they are implemented also in collaboration and cooperation with indigenous organizations and other civil society organizations. But this project in Guatemala, this other project implemented by UNDP, UNESCO, and UN Women, trained 73 indigenous Mam and Ixil community leaders from 2 different parts of the country in conflict transformation, and work closely with indigenous authorities in the Ixil region to increase women's participation in local indigenous institutions, as well as to improve the capacities for the participation of both men and women in consultation processes in accordance with international standards on the right to prior, free, and informed consultation. In fact, the project also supported the Xinca Indigenous Parliament in the consultation process that was taking place in the context of a mining project in a specific part of the country. And in Guatemala, the PBF is also supporting indigenous youth through a project that aims at improving indigenous youth agency and access to safe spaces for civic participation in local planning processes in the departments of Huehuetenango and Petén. So basically, this is support to young indigenous youth so that they can have a more active and significant participation in planning, local planning processes, including on development and the sort. So this is just a sample of how the Peacebuilding Fund is trying to bring together the UN system, national authorities, civil society, and indigenous peoples in addressing common peacebuilding priorities. while at the same time contributing to increase Indigenous people's significant participation in conflict prevention, transformation, and peace building. So that's a little bit of what I wanted to share with you. I'm still staying with you for a little longer with my colleagues, so happy to take on any questions, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Fiorella and Bautista. And I know, Fiorella, we were with each other for the UN Religion and Mediation course in Colombia, where we were focusing on the engagement of Indigenous mediators in Colombia, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And it was a really resounding statement of interest for everyone involved to learn more and unpack this area as a way of advancing Indigenous peoples' leadership in these processes. So looking forward also to thinking about how we can continue strengthening those efforts in the coming new year. So now, if you have any questions for our UN counterparts, if you want to put that in the chat, I would ask them to just kind of monitor and to be able to follow up with you directly in the chat so that we can continue to our next panel. Just to keep time, I can go ahead and introduce our panel. The panel today will be with Queen Gladys Mabuya, who is the president and International Federation of Women Lawyers, FIDA, in Cameroon. We will also be joined by Bina Lakshmi Napram, who is the founder director for Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network and convener of the Global Alliance of Indigenous Peoples, Gender Justice and Peace. And our final panelist will be Tongpeng Longchar, who is the volunteer for Initiatives of Change India. So we have a good lineup here. Let me just see if I can spotlight. But the first question goes to everyone, but we'll start with you, Queen Gladys, on what are the primary obstacles that traditional or Indigenous peoples face when attempting to mobilize for peace? What success have you had in addressing those challenges?
I intend to give a background of why we need to advance the participation of traditional leaders because this is how I prepared this presentation. I wanted to quickly give a background of why we should include traditional actors in peace building, and then I will give some examples of what they have been doing and how they do it and the challenges we face and the achievements. So why is it important to advance their inclusion? Because I said, even though the state has the primary responsibility to protect to protect populations, long before colonization, Africa had traditional institutions headed by traditional leaders and actors that were used to uphold the values of peace, tolerance, solidarity, respect for one another. These traditional leaders and actors are officially recognized by the government, and they play an important role in realizing sustainable peace in their communities. They hold a significant role in local governance, security, taxation, and conflict mediation, especially in the absence of the state authorities. They have established governance systems which include conflict prevention, dispute mechanisms, peace building, and humanitarian initiatives, and they hold credibility and legitimacy within the communities they serve. So atrocity crimes, if not prevented, can cause immense suffering, undermine respect for peace and development, and leave scars on communities and societies that can take generations to heal. Traditional authorities have a way of fighting these crimes. They are guided by moral values and beliefs, and belief systems which have been passed down from one generation to the next. They spread messages of peace, tolerance, acceptance, and mutual respect, and by taking action to reduce tensions between communities. So those are some of the strategies. These traditional authorities, as I said, they hold significant role in local governance, security, taxation, which include but not limited to conflict prevention. So they have all of those know-how to prevent conflict. They use a dispute mechanism and peace building, humanitarian initiatives that are acceptable by the people, the whole credibility and legitimacy. And they actually have, I want to paint a picture of how the governance system that they have in place. Because in a traditional setting, African traditional setting, you have the fawn, who is the head of the community, well respected and loved by everyone. And he is the head of every activity that takes place in that community. He has a traditional council they call the Quit-For. I wrote it in our dialect, and which is a secret society that he heads, and they respect and listen to him. He has the male traditional council made up of elderly men and individuals in the society that are well respected. He has a female traditional council, they call it the Tekembeng, and this female traditional council is headed by the Queen Mother. So that is a section of the governance that I head personally in my village, and they act as a parallel to the main secret society. This council champions the rights of women and makes their voices heard. A major criterion to belong to this council is your age, and you must prove that you no longer menstruate, that you must have reached the age of menopause, and you must show that you are a widow, because you must not have any relationship with men. So then they have the youth council. The youth council is very important because it actually, it's made up of good, well-behaved youth in the community who are exemplary in their behavior. So they actually show that they disassociate themselves from all violence and wrongdoing, and their fundamental role there is to maintain peace in the community. So so what methods do they use? In traditional African societies, people live a communal way of life. They practice participatory democracy, where decisions were taken by consensus at village meetings, during which everyone would sit down informally to discuss and agree on important issues. The ultimate aim of every conflict resolution is amicable settlement in the end. They arrive this by persuasion, mediation, adjudication, reconciliation, arbitration, and negotiation, not necessarily reverting to the use of force or coercion at all costs. In doing so, unnecessary competition is avoided. This traditional justice approach enhances reconciliation and healing amongst communities. So in resolving conflicts, the principle of equity and justice, which is entrenched in African customs and traditions, are upheld. Basically, crime was considered as in our communities, crime is considered as an act that offends the entire community and is harmful to the gods and the criminal. And a criminal was tried by traditional council headed by the fund sitting with the council of elders. The judge cases referred to them ranging from incest, poisoning, witchcraft, threat of life, treason, stealing, murder, incest, abuse of elders, willful damage to property, lying, bearing false witness, and rape. As a preventive measure to promote the virtues of peace, solidarity, harmonious living, respect for others, and honesty, traditional societies instituted the celebration of festivals, during which these values were extolled in song, rituals, and sacrifices were performed to the village deities and ancestors for peace, protection, good work, fertility, and so on. The culture of communal life created an ideal environment for conflict resolution, because it was also an opportunity for a mutual exchange of privileges, good favors, obligations, amongst others. Reciprocity, equality fostered peaceful coexistence and consequently eliminated the likelihood of conflict and wars. So this is briefly a common practice in traditional society: prevent, manage, and resolve conflict sometimes through oath-taking. I'm painting this picture in answer of your question, Jessica, that this is how traditional dispute resolutions are being carried out with huge success. And that is why it is important to include traditional leaders in conflict resolution or peace building processes. Because all what I have said before shows that an inclusive way of handling disputes was the method that traditional leaders used. The people felt a sense of belonging to every process that took place, And that is why they could easily abide by every sanction or every decision that came out of the traditional council. They felt it was that everybody was fully involved, and they felt that in the end, no, this was all of us, and it is a good decision, and they always respect it. That's why you see I put sanctions and executions, because first of all, every sanction that was meted out during this period is meant to reconcile the people and not to instead divide them. The ultimate aim of conflict resolution within the traditional setting is amicable settlement by persuasion, as I said before, and not reverting to the use of force by all means. There is, in the end, they don't award, there is no award for winning an argument as such. The end result of conflict resolution is to accommodate all parties involved in the conflict through genuine collaboration by all, in the search for effective compromise. In doing so, unnecessary competition. African traditional mechanisms of conflict prevention, management, and resolution were largely effective and respected, and their decisions were binding on all the parties. Their processes place emphasis not on the guilt of the wrongdoer, but on restoring relationships and finding a solution that is amenable to all involved. This emphasis on saving the relationship has many similarities to current practices of mediation. So basically, this is the method that they use traditionally that gets everyone so interested, and they try to say, no, this is our community, and they try to reconcile people. We have succeeded that way because we don't use the system of blame trading or just punishing people to break the community. Every decision is taken to make sure at the end people reconcile, and they reconcile and live in cohesion. Against there will be social cohesion and all of that. So have we been doing this without any challenges? I think of recent, before, traditional methods of resolution were very effective. Traditional authorities were highly respected, and everything they said was respected. But of recent, their powers have been weakened by recent armed conflicts. Especially in my own country, armed conflicts have weakened their powers, and the state too is making an effort to delegitimize traditional leaders and actors. Armed youths and the absence of police to enforce law and order continue to challenge the work of traditional leaders, especially in the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon, where I belong. The presence of illegal firearms. This conflict has actually made a lot of youth to have firearms illegally in their hands, and that is making the work of the traditional leaders very difficult. Traditional leaders too, poverty is one of their problems, and the inadequate capacity of the local government officials and even the traditional rulers to carry out their role in collaboration is part of the challenges they face. Traditional institutions have been weakened and even destroyed in many societies, especially as modern law courts came to pronounce judgments rather than resolve conflicts according to the African administration of justice. In this new legal system, the police are taking up cases that hitherto were handled through traditional amicable settlements, with emphasis on, and tradition used to handle this with emphasis on reconciliation and restoration of social harmony, rather than on punishing the conflicting parties. So those are some of the challenges they face. To conclude, I said long before the slave trade and colonization, indigenous African society had its own traditional methods and mechanisms of preventing, managing, and resolving conflict. These ideas were well entrenched in the tradition, custom, norms, and taboos of the people's way of life, as it were. As a people have not lost the capacity to coexist peacefully and commune. With the introduction of law courts, paralegals, the police, and other forces, justice does not always bring about peace and coexistence to the people. Traditional dispute resolution mechanisms may achieve both, considering that negotiations, mediation, and reconciliations have deep roots in indigenous communities which still have a strong belief in the principles of common humanity, reciprocity, and respect for one another. Submitting a dispute to a group of elders is always voluntary. That is how we have succeeded to manage some of these conflicts, because they don't force anybody, although family and social pressure do so often strong. And both parties must consent to accept the result. Traditional justice mechanisms have the advantage of being familiar to the population and are less costly and are more accessible than courts. So this is to encourage the traditional justice system, because for all of these reasons that I've given above, it has been more successful to handle disputes in a traditional way than in the modern law courts. They are seen as fierce. Our chiefs are well respected. That's what I'm trying to say here. And they look up to them like some people with natural, supernatural powers, and in some cases, descendants, and think that they are descendants of mysterious or divine conquerors. And so they can be strong partners in the prevention of atrocity crimes and their incitement. And for this reason, they should be involved in every effort to prevent atrocity crimes. To realize our shared vision, in order to realize our shared vision of peaceful, inclusive, and just societies in which diversity is valued and the rights of all individuals are protected, let us work together with our traditional leaders and actors to prevent and end atrocity crimes and all affront to human rights and dignity. I ended this with so every effort should be made, the UN, our governments, to disarm civilians who are holding arms illegally. Deploy unified forces, including police, to maintain law and order and protect the chiefs, because the chiefs they are now in so unsecured areas that they are even afraid to do the normal work they used to do. Chiefs used to be highly respected, but I'll tell you people now, because of conflicts, children even speak rudely to the chiefs, something we never knew before, just because they have guns that they can come and threaten the chiefs with. Establish many reformatory centers for suspects of crime, so that if they can keep them and reform them, there should be a more meaningful engagement, representation of women and youth in traditional leadership structures, peace building and conflict resolution initiatives. The powers of the chiefs should be restored. National legislation for establishing a compulsory quota of traditional leaders and actors to be included in all peace processes should be enacted, because we realize that, as we are just saying here, most traditional rulers, they have an important role to play in peace building, conflict resolution, to fight crime, but they are often ignored when it comes to those processes. They are not found on those spaces where those issues are discussed. We should formalizing their role in conflict management is key for peace. So this must be done. Lastly, this is the last slide. Strengthen and support traditional discussion resolution mechanisms to prevent atrocity crimes, including by utilizing peace mediation in situations at risk of these crimes. Develop strategic communication and messaging for alternative or counter narratives targeting actors of incitement or violence. Engaging and strengthening inter-community dialogue and activities to foster social cohesion. Provide capacity building and capacity sharing opportunities. Strengthen engagement and decentralization processes with political leaders to increase the capacity of traditional leaders. So, grosso modo, this presentation, I decided to give a vivid picture of how and why it is very important to include them by showing the processes through which they carry out their own peace building processes, how they fight crime in their communities, and which has yielded a lot of success before. So we should not let go good work they used to do in the past. So we should make sure we involve them in all of these processes, we build their capacity, and we try to address all the challenges that I have raised in this presentation. Thank you so much, Jessica. I hope if my presentation did not answer the question, then you can ask it again.
Thank you, Queen Gladys. I think it was a really good way of showcasing some of these intersecting links in the conversation, around decolonization and modernity and where the support is needed in these traditional or indigenous structures and movements. So I would also be curious, with what you said about the chiefs and their struggle with getting the same level of power and respect in the communities, if it would be the same in other regions. So now I'm going to actually turn it to our next presenter to be able to hear from her. Bina, for your context and for your community, if you could talk about what you think the primary obstacles that Indigenous peoples are facing when attempting to mobilize for peace, and what success you've had in addressing those challenges.
Thank you very much. First of all, I greet you all in my Indigenous language, which is Manipuri, Mayam Butaram na Okchiri. It means I pay my obeisance to each and everyone who is gathered here today. And really thank you to the network for inviting me. I also pay my respects to the traditional, our elders past and present. Because of their work and their courage, we are here today on this International Human Rights Day. Let us take a moment. I see so many people joining from all over the world, to just take a moment to say we survived doing this work. All of us are so lucky that we have survived till today doing this work. Last year, more than 300 human rights defenders were killed. 1/3 were indigenous, trying to defend their land, their rights, their properties. Currently, my home state, Manipur, is undergoing a genocide. And it is very painful when young children, infants, have been slaughtered in our home regions. But again, we are meeting today in hope and in faith that working together, I'm so happy that today all of us are here. Civil society, leaders, United Nations, and well-meaning people who want these conflicts to end. So I just wanted to take this moment. And the other thing that I will also try to put a little bit of a background is the fact that, number one, let us remember that currently we are living in a world of wars, 107 conflicts. It is not just the conflicts that you see in your normal television or on a Twitter or X feeds every day in the Middle East, in Burma, in other parts of the world, but there are 107 conflicts in the world today, and 120 million people have left their homes. They're in relief camps, 300 of them in my own homestead alone, hundreds of them in Burma, hundreds of them in the Sahel region, hundreds of them in Sudan and the Middle East. So we are really living through a very critical time in history where we are not progressing as a human civilization, we are regressing. As a result, it is really important that we take a moment to see where have we succeeded and where we got to improve. Where indigenous leaders come in some of the research that we have done, 80% of the world's conflicts, 80% of the world's conflicts in today's world are happening in biodiversity hotspots where indigenous people live. I repeat, 80% of the world's conflicts happening in biodiversity hotspots where indigenous people live. As a result, if peace building have failed in the last several decades, it's because indigenous people have not been included in peace talks, peace processes, in negotiation, mediation. Like our UN representatives have said today, they have been left out of many of these decision-making processes. That's number one. Number two, having said this, let us remember how strong we are together. 476 million indigenous people living in 90 countries and territories worldwide. I have met Indigenous people who are only 300 in number. I have met Indigenous leaders, Indigenous communities who are in their millions. But we are continuing to work together. The topic or the elements that I have been given are: what are the challenges, what are the success, and what are the practical advice that we have for the UN and other multilateral bodies. So one of the challenges that I have found is, number one, there is repeated attempt of erasure of Indigenous people in today's world, because our land, our resources are so rich, but yet many governments, many transnational criminal networks started operating in our lands, and they are killing us. The Manipur conflict, where more than hundreds of people have been killed in the last 18 months, where 70,000 people are living in 300 relief camps right now, is an example of how you can destroy our indigenous territories in ways that we are destroying our humanity. So that is one thing which is a very critical challenge. Continuum of trying to erase and commit acts of genocide on indigenous communities is one of the greatest challenges that we have to collectively face together. And I'm seeing it every single day. Number two, in terms of what is happening so at the moment, many people who are profiting from conflicts. Somebody told me a couple of months ago that, Bina, peace doesn't profit, conflict profits. As our communities are put under war, arms manufacturers are laughing their way to the bank. Narco traffickers are reducing our indigenous territories into sites of their plantation for the illegal crops. As a result, so many and armed militias are being funneled by people who are hungry for power. It could be anyone, including tapping our indigenous children to be child soldiers. All of these, I'm talking from experience, not from any books, but we're experiencing this every single day. And most importantly, with the use of social media, with the use of WhatsApp, poisoning indigenous communities to hate each other, poisoning brothers against brothers, sisters against sisters, village against village, that now they have created buffer zones by heavily armed militias, as if people have forgotten Gandhi, people have forgotten King, people have forgotten those who have espoused for nonviolence to resolve our conflicts. Rather, they are arming our children as young as 14 years old to hate each other in our indigenous territories. And these are some of the challenges that we are bringing and we are experiencing every single day. To control us, they have put martial law. I have grown up under a martial law in Manipur. Martial law still exists in the world's largest democracy where I come from. And these are some of the ways. And then they ban our internet anytime. They take us away. They do not allow press to come to several of our territories. So these are some of the complete erasure, blocking, blanking out indigenous histories, indigenous narratives, indigenous ways. These are some of the challenges that we are experiencing for several decades in our lives. So I just wanted to give how critical it is. I myself have been threatened for our work several times. So as indigenous rights defenders, we have. On top of that, one of the challenges that we also face is more on a more global level. That nation states are now not recognizing that indigenous people exist. For example, in Russia, if you are 50,000 in number, then you are not longer recognized as indigenous. I work with hundreds of indigenous leaders in Russia. And in China, they do not recognize indigenous people, though China has signed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. China calls them ethnic minorities. Bangladesh government is doing the same. And currently, so these are some of the challenges that nation states, India has said that 1.3 billion Indians are all indigenous. So we now have a criticality in which nation states have started saying that indigenous people are not existing in our territories and delineating that term. This is a larger issue that we will have to work very closely with supportive governments, with the UN, and with civil society to do that. Now, let me come to the success part. So yes, when we started our work from Manipur and northeast of India to the rest of the world, we realized what we were facing in one indigenous territories is happening also in the Sahel region. It's happening in the Burmese region. It's happening in Sudan. So we realized, and then in 2019, we formed this global alliance of indigenous people, gender, justice, and peace. So we started mapping out, connecting with indigenous leaders from around the world, from 7 socio-cultural zones. We started meeting up because, you know, if you ask what is indigenous, and I've worked very closely with legal experts as well as general experts, the word indigenous is like the word mother or child. It is a self-defining term, and you know you are indigenous. It is a term never meant to divide communities. It's not a term to scare the government. It is not a term of separation. It's a term which many marginalized people left out in the margins of society and modern communities are telling, include us in your processes so that we can be a part of your community building, your nation building, your global peace building. So this is what we have done. We have been continuing to meet even during COVID time. And then when I was at Harvard Kennedy School, we convened an entire meeting to look at militarization and warfare in indigenous territories. And this year, we were able to take this work at the first global summit on indigenous peace building, held on 11th and 12th of April 2024 in Washington, D.C., in which we drafted the first international declaration on indigenous peace building. And then I also advised the U.S. Institute of Peace. So we are really grateful to the Institute of Peace for having given us that platform. And then we were able to take this work, and Florella is here with us. We indigenous leaders took the declaration and gave it to the UN headquarters. And then we were able to also formed at that summit, we launched a global network of indigenous peace builders, mediators, and negotiators. So we feel that this is a work, I feel today when I'm attending this meeting with all of you, you know, the network and all of you leaders, youth, communities joining in from around the world, I feel that our circle is complete. All the different pieces of work that you all have been working so hard, many of you putting your lives at risk. I feel today we have come to a full circle. And I'm so grateful for this. And we would like to continue to work in partnership with each one of us, because we all have our strengths, we all have our weaknesses. Let us put our strengths together to build. My final practical advice, since the United Nations is also here, and we have heard several of them today, is number 1. Thank you so much for the work that you have done. Continue to be of support to indigenous communities worldwide. And I understand that the word indigenous at the UN level is still under a lot of discussion and debate. And we are going to approach this with a lot of love, with a lot of care, because governments are also made from people like us. So we are not separate. So we have to convince and use our mediation skills, our skill that indigenous people have so much of richness. And finally, to realize that countries one day are able to not see indigenous people as a threat, but rather as an important fabric in the pathway towards peace and development. And finally, I would like to just end with the first article that was drafted at the Indigenous Declaration. And with that, I will end that the world of today urgently needs meaningful peace building that works for all. 80% of the conflicts around the world are happening, as I mentioned, in biodiversity areas where indigenous people live. This is unacceptable and needs to be immediately addressed. We must reduce this to zero violence on indigenous territories where many of our marginalized communities live. And we must remember the lives lost and remember the wisdom that will get us through this, that will pave the way for healing people, peace, and planet. Mother Earth, document the lives lost and many who are still missing in action. Care must be taken and survivors' assistance given to relief and rehabilitation provided to those who are in need. So these are some of the texts, and we remember the words of Chip Seattle that humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread in it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect. So as we move forward for 2025, and Indigenous people does not say that the year is ending, we say the year is turning. So let us turn this year around. I know it has been a challenging year, but I'm so glad that thank you, all of you, for bringing us together. We feel that we have the strength, the energy, the resilience, the wisdom, and the humility to be able to take this really critical work together in the years to come. Thank you, Yam Nungay Jere.
Thank you, Bina. And I know there was a lot of heartfelt solidarity felt with you in the chat. A lot of people standing with you in some of the points that you were making around peace doesn't profit, conflict profits. You know, the 80% of conflicts happen in the most biodiverse places where Indigenous people live. So I think you had a lot of really important points, especially now I'm reframing how I'm thinking about the coming turning of the new year. So thank you so much for your wisdom, and also looking forward to working with you in the coming year to see how we can continue building on the international declaration and how we can continue building out this work. So thank you so much again for your wisdom. And if anybody has any questions so far for Queen Gladys and Bina, you can also put those in the chat, and they can continue to follow up with you in the chat. For now, I will turn to our last speaker on the panel, Tong Pang. So I'd love to hear from you from a youth perspective too, on what you think as an Indigenous youth, what the primary obstacles facing Indigenous people when mobilizing for peace, and what success you've had in addressing those challenges.
Hey, Tompang here, and I will just cut to the point because two of our sisters have spoken the realities and the challenges, and before that, the introduction has been made. What are the challenges that's going across the world at the moment? Before I start, I just wanted to just give a background that I belong to a community and a group of a community which is an indigenous community from India and Myanmar, the Naga community. The Naga is the umbrella term used for a couple of tribes, and I belong to our tribe. And so the Chunky Council is the village council that I come from. And I'm giving a little background just to give you all an understanding of how complex and how the system of people from indigenous backgrounds also have, you know. So for me, from an umbrella group, again, umbrella group also dilutes many things at times. You know, when you are in India, you're all becoming Indians, you know. So, but India also has its own diversity like that. Many other countries have its own diversity. For me, for my community, the Nagas, we are independent villages. Each village is like a country, to be honest, very clear. So my village is Chunky, and I owe my support and then a lot of respect to the council and the elders and all the Naga elders as well, all across the world, wherever they are spread around. One thing to understand is that for young people like me and then who are from indigenous or non-indigenous background, it doesn't matter, but if you are working with a community, I think we need to know the community. We need to know about their traditions, their culture, their faith. I think a little background and knowledge from academic point of view and a very practical, live-in experience, embodied experience is a must. And for me, I had to understand, even though I am from an indigenous background, what I do is I try to understand the culture, the village, or the community that I go and work with. And I'll just give an example of my village because that's much easier and easier to explain for me. So in my village, Nagas, I won't go into the history or the indigenous conflicts and all. I'll just go to the point where we need to understand how to work with the indigenous communities. So we have the traditional systems that are old systems, traditions which are passed on from generation to generation. So for my village also, we have a system called the Mungthang or the Hu system. The Hu system generally practically means the age system. According to age, among the Naga tribes and Naga villages, we are divided with different roles of administration. So I am from a particular age, which is having a responsibility for my village, and we can make certain decisions according to that. And then we have Mungthang. The word Mungthang, I know it's very difficult for some people, but what I'm trying to say is, in English, it literally means a gathering, a consensus gathering, where, it can take a day or two, but in this age, people try to wrap it up in one day. But the thing is, it takes a day or two or three. It depends on the situation and then the consensus from the people. And then every age group of the village comes in. So these are old traditions that are still under practice. And then again, to make it a little more interesting, now comes the contemporary practices, which is out of education, modern education, out of modern needs and modern to challenge the contemporary situations, understanding. So we have the student body or the youth body. For my village, we have CKL, that means Chanki Kakatse Longjam. So that means a gathering of young people, a gathering of students, gathering of academicians. So this is a group of people, young people. Would you help me shut that? Yeah. And there is another body called the women body, the village women, because there's something missing in the traditional systems as well. Some people might not like me for saying this, but yes, there's always something to add on. So indigenous or the traditional systems also lack a lot of women participation. And then in the contemporary world, in the contemporary system for my village, we have the women body, which only women representatives from the village take part, and then they put in their challenges or issues or whatever needs to be discussed in the village. And then now we have the church body or any whatever so-and-so religion that the indigenous community belongs. So indigenous religion, we do have our indigenous religion, but at the same time, we have a major, like the indigenous people are we are free to choose whatever faith. Everyone is free to choose whatever faith. But unfortunately, or unfortunately, I would say most of us in my village are Christians. I would say 99%. So there is a church body now, the contemporary church body, which governs us, directs and guides the people. Now, ultimately, there is another third one to make it more complex or make it more easier. So the third is the state system. So the first one which I said was the traditional system, which is like, by blood and then, by roots, we are there. The second one is the contemporary systems that is coming in, the youth body, women body, the church body, and whatnot, society body. And then the third one, which I'm putting it, is the government, the state system. Now, the state system has put in councils, village councils of village heads, which are like the bureaucrats of the village, which communicate and speak terms for the government, So it can be government, it's through government of Nagaland and government of India. So things can get a little messy and a little confusing, but our people have learned how to deal with it. So here, this is just the village that I'm sharing about. The village has this kind of treating systems. And then in that village system, we have the clan systems. In my village, we are 13 clans, and each clan has an elder. So now the Mongdang or the traditional courts handle that. Then they come up with a resolution, they go to the state elected council, and then they have a discussion, and then after that, suggestions and everything from youth, women body, and the church comes in as well, adds on as well. So that's how a decision is made in my village. So I'll put a hold on that. And also, just add on that indigenous communities or traditional communities also doesn't mean just sticking to rigidity. Me coming from a young indigenous background, I would say I think indigenous concept is also very much misled or very much attached with patriarchy. So I think we need to break that thought. And there's no rigidity. I don't see rigidity. Indigenous systems also grow with experience. With my few years of profession, to be precise, 9 years of profession in peace building and 32 years living as an indigenous young man, I have certain clarities that came out, which doesn't totally agree with the academic point of view or the governance point of view from the state. But I see working with indigenous community needs us or people to really work and understand the community or the village at the micro level, really understanding that. Of course, I'm not saying that we don't need a central body to administer or monitor. Yes, we do need a general, general code of conduct and everything. But this general code of conduct or the central code of conduct or laws or rules must not dilute the tradition, the rights, and the justice from the local bodies, local traditional bodies or the traditional systems. And then the traditional systems also, I feel, must adhere to contemporary, contemporary, it must tackle the contemporary challenges as well. So some of the things that I have put forward every time with the councils or the people over here and then the communities where I work in. So some of the things that I would like to put here also to the network and then the people here listening to from a young man's or a youth perspective, that we do have challenges. We do have challenges because indigenous communities or indigenous tribes, unfortunately, most of them are in a mess, in the sense they get into conflict, they get into misunderstanding, they get into stereotypes, they get into, again, if you see the financial background or the whatever infrastructure needs or anything, unfortunately, most of our communities lack that. So with the stereotypes, with all these challenges, overall challenges, there is lack in understanding or dialogue between indigenous and non-indigenous communities, and then even among the indigenous communities. So a lot of dialogues are needed among the communities, intra or inter, it doesn't matter. And then the dialogues in different levels, I would say, elders, women, and youth. Youth must be put in, and then it can be put even separately, but I think intergenerational is very helpful, according to my experience. And there's another thing that I would like to add is the diplomacy or diplomatic workshops or gathering. Why I'm saying is that traditional leaders and traditional systems doesn't actually also have, that quoted, I would say, like logical or state or government type of view, like, the government administers top bottom. So these are grassroots and then ground-based, the public-based, consensus-based. So it can be very much, clashing, and there is a lot of misunderstanding, and it doesn't work. The systems doesn't work. I think there must be programs and then specialized gatherings for, where we can talk about micro, macro, and, we can talk about politics as well. So lastly, capacity building programs to fund and projects are something that young people would like to, and space where we can really bring in youth for exchange and then work on policies and then work on really skills. Skills is also something that we can train and work with the people. Yeah. So anyway, that's where I want to end, and then I would like to see if there are questions and all, because I work with a lot of communities in India, not just the tribes from the Northeast India, but the tribes and communities from the central part of India, the southern India, and then northern India. And then each tribe is different. Each tribe has their own challenges. Some are under the attack or challenge of competition from the corporates. Some are inter conflicts, like our sister earlier mentioned. Some are directly governmental conflicts. Some are more on identity conflict. So there are a lot of different conflicts, even in my country, India. But again, I leave the space open for questions so that I can give more answer accordingly. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you, Tong Feng. And you say that with what limited experience you have, but I've known you now for several years, so you have a lot of experience already, traveling the world with us and giving your inputs. And I think you made really good points about how young people are continuing to shape the different traditional and indigenous mechanisms to adapt, and to bring new ways of promoting inclusion. So now, if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please put it in the chat. And then we'll be now looking to hear from everyone in the meeting. So I'm going to now open up the breakout rooms for everyone to join. Welcome back. I think we're all back from the rooms. I know that was a really, really quick turnaround. There's just been so much that's been shared today. But I want to be able to get a sense of what was shared in each of the rooms. So I'll ask each of our group facilitators to do a quick 2-minute readout. So first, I'll turn it to group 1, Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, so again, short amount of time, but we got some good perspectives in the short amount of time from a variety of contexts, including Asia and Africa. So one thing that was brought up specifically was about how there tends to be a barrier for or a hesitancy for some religious leaders to engage with indigenous or traditional actors because of misunderstandings on the traditions, on the culture, and even language barriers. But moving to the second question, we were able to discuss a little bit more about mindfulness and respect, or respect towards building trust. And so there are some ways in which those can be addressed. But we also saw that one way in which could actively engage with traditional or indigenous actors is through, really their buy-in, ensuring that you have consent in order to, help and mediate and do whatever, following the practices, learning as much about the culture as possible in order to get full buy-in as active participants. But also community-based dialogue is invaluable to addressing conflict. And then another participant mentioned that some of the traditional ways in which they solve conflict within Ethiopia specifically through meaningful collaboration, through learning about the culture and the language, and also the challenges that they're facing as there is no singular way in which to address mediation or address conflict within a variety of different traditions. And then also the challenges of engaging women as active participants within peacebuilding and mediation processes. So I'll pause there because I want to be respectful of the other groups. But if there's anything that I missed, please, anybody from my group, throw it in the chat.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll turn it to group 2 now with Oshan.
Yes, thank you. I will also be very brief. So we had a very enriching discussion, although it was short. Many of us were able to share some of our previous experience and some inputs from the insights from the ground. So I will condense it into like 5 points. So first of all, we all acknowledge that the inclusion of all communities when it comes to indigenous groups and religious groups needs to be maintained in a very effective manner, especially looking at cultural barriers and restrictions working in the ground level. So for example, in certain communities, there youth may not be seen as wise enough to be involved in certain discussions. So creating pathways that actually avoid these discriminations needs to be done. And while we are doing our good work in the ground, we also need to be mindful of not causing harm. Like while doing the peace building work, how are we going to maintain that non-invasiveness and that neutral responsibility towards the community to not cause further harm by being present there, and giving space for stories and personal stories that break the identity barriers and divide us. And like these stories could be the reason that we can find a collective passion for peace. Also understanding the intersections of indigenous and religious identities and utilizing that connection for creating pathways for a more inclusive peace, a culture of peace that we are trying to develop. And finally, we also came to acknowledge that we need to start documenting the indigenous and traditional approaches to peace building. This is much needed to understand our idea of peace building and connecting it with the ground realities of indigenous and local communities. So that might also be something very important we need to do as practitioners in the ground. So those were our inputs, but yeah, there will be more once the things come up. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Group 2. And last but not least, Group 3 with Hussein.
Hussein was having some connectivity issues, so I might have to do our readout. Like all the other groups, we weren't able to talk with everybody, but the few people that were able to speak was mostly focused on communities in Africa. So we talked a lot about the importance of including Indigenous peoples in peace building work, but that also includes expanding the understanding of what is peace building, and that a lot of Indigenous peoples are working on peace work, and just their existence themselves is inherently related to peace building, even if they're not necessarily using those words. So also just expanding the understanding of what peace building is, including Indigenous youth, which was already mentioned, not just going through leadership, and also not giving direct funding to these inclusive organizations instead of funding through national or regional entities, or politicians that may use it for corrupt reasons. Working with Indigenous structures, not just again through these like the normal partners in government, but really trying to use the Indigenous peoples' really advanced like community structures to the advantage of the peace building community. And also just encouraging the UN to try different tactics for engagement, like I said, going through different entities, not just looking at the national or the regional side, and bringing people to the table, and at the same time understanding how are we shaping that table, how is participation designed, are we giving decision-making power to Indigenous peoples directly, or are we just inviting them to the table to check off a box? Yes, please, if anyone from my group, if I missed something, feel free to jump in.
Thank you, Hannah, in Group 3. And this is actually a perfect moment to spotlight Hannah to say that Hannah is our new UN Advocacy Coordinator, replacing, for some of you who knew Siam, so she'll actually be leading the charge next year in helping to launch the plan of action and our engagement with traditional and Indigenous communities in peace building. So happy to connect her with you all if you would like, or she can maybe put her contact details in the chat. But just wanted to again thank everyone for so much wisdom shared today. And I know it's getting to where everyone's closing out. So just thank you for also taking the time. Again, I want to thank the 2024 Inclusivity Community Practice Steering Committee. You can read all about this year's steering committee here. But if you would like to apply to be part of the 2025 Inclusivity Steering Committee, I will put the link for the form in the chat. And I'll also share the recording and the follow-ups from today so that you have that. But again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and looking forward to turning in the next year with you.